Hi everyone, I hope you're all well this week. Today we are going to talk about emergency management within governance frameworks. Now, governance is pretty important because, as this slide shows in the picture, it helps local communities overcome different types of crises. So it's pretty important that I give you a little bit of background about this. Now, this is fairly content heavy. I'm going to try and flick through it as quickly as I can. But in all honesty, it is a very complex area. So it's pretty difficult to just flick through it. So by the end of the lecture, I'm hoping you know a little bit more about what governance is, how governance is related to emergency management, so that you have some semblance of understanding of how emergency management is governed in Australia. Because quite frankly, I don't think I'm even at that point yet. And the importance of emergency management governance locally, nationally and internationally, and I'll talk very briefly about that. So when we think of emergency management and the governance of those different types of practices, it's important to remind ourselves very briefly about how we define that. The definitions of emergency management make it seem like a really simple process, but in fact it's often not. So we've got things like mitigation, preparedness, response and recovery, those 4 different phases that we talked about earlier in the semester. Every single one of these is involved in the governance of emergency management in some way. In Australia, though, we have a very comprehensive, overarching approach, which is, I would argue, much more complicated than I ever anticipated. Than I ever anticipated. Governance as a concept is complex enough, but the governance of emergency management is more complex because of all of the different things that it requires. It requires governance within organisations, across different types of organisations, government, non-government, and of course public and private organisations. Governance happens across organisations and across jurisdictional boundaries. There are different forms of legislative governance, and that is something that controls what happens in emergency management situations. Governance also happens across a range of different actors, all with different roles, differing levels of skills and training, and differing investments in the different processes of emergency management. And of course, governance happens through the range of different phases that I was talking about before, through mitigation and preparedness right at the front, all the way through through response and recovery right at the end of those processes. So the governance of emergency management can literally happen over years and years and years in relation just to one specific hazard or disaster, right? But most importantly, it's perpetual. It never stops. It's constantly happening. So what does governance mean then? I really do just want to take a moment to define this particular term because it's going to help us understand the rest of this particular lecture. Governance is a bit of a slippery term, and it can be referring to a whole range of different practices that help to understand and guide the processes of emergency management in this case, but also in conjunction to a range of different organisations and contexts. So it's something that's related to the whole of the public sector, including emergency services, and the different definitions that we've got are quite broad in that respect. So it's systems of regulation and ordering that have developed in contemporary societies, and these governing activities are dispersed throughout a whole network of agencies. The informal and formal arrangements that determine how public decisions are made and how public actions are carried out. And this happens from the perspective of maintaining a country's constitutional values in the face of changing problems, actors and environments. So that's a definition that comes from the OECD. Defining governance around emergencies, however, I would argue is even a little bit more complex than that. So we've got definitions like these from Sandoval and Ross. The set of interrelated regulatory frameworks and norms organisations, institutions and practices within the disaster cycle, so response, recovery, mitigation, preparedness, all of that sort of stuff, that are organised at multiple social and geographical scales to anticipate, cope with, resist and recover from, so that bounce back stuff that we were talking about, the impact of a natural or human-made disaster. Whew, that is a mouthful. Disaster governance encompasses organisational and institutional actors from formal governments, private companies and civil society bodies, all the way through to informal organisations such as networks and elites. So that is huge. Like, there is physically probably not a single person in Australia that is not somehow connected with this stuff in some way or another, because that does, of course, include you and me. The relationships between sets of rules, actors and organisations can be configured in horizontal and vertical governance arrangements to try and help with these things. The complexity of this is not to be underestimated. It happens at a range of different levels. Individuals, emergency service and defence organisations, local government regulations and arrangements, state government regulations and arrangements, federal government regulations and arrangements, national and cross-border regulations and arrangements, as well as international emergency incident management. And this is just a few of the potential levels in which this kind of governance happens. You can see this in this image that I've taken from a site around New South Wales emergency management, where they have the emergency management arrangements in the centre, and then the community, the local government, functional areas, state government, Commonwealth government, emergency service organisations and non-government organisations all have a role to play in that process. It is quite possibly the most brain-bending thing I've ever had to read about in my entire life. So why is emergency management governance important? It's important because it relates to this notion of resilience. How do we bounce back from a particular hazard or disaster or emergency happening in our local community? So this particular quote I really like from, I think it's Capuccio and Sadiq, but I could be totally wrong again because I'm daft with these things. They say, community disaster resilience is considered a function of a community's collaborative governance. It helps develop community capacity through adaptive management and continuous learning. So many big words in these definitions. It's collaborative and adaptive forms of governance as a method of collective decision making that promote the capacity of organisations and community stakeholders to adjust and adapt their evolving relationships in a dynamic environment of disasters. Holy freaking cow. But you can see just how complex this stuff is. Even just looking at this simple, I'm not going to say it's simple, this diagram that looks at governance arrangements in the US context. So we can see federal emergency management, regional, state, we can see local, as well as other local government agencies, as well as the emergency management agencies. That then comes down to community level organisations, and you can see that they all feed into one another. As well as down below, we've got the multi-level network governance that's happening there. We've got adaptive resilience, engineering resilience, community disaster resilience across to the side, and then we've got organisational capacity, community capital, and other external factors like political, economic and social environments. This is really a complex thing to try and get your head around. Just having a look, for instance, at the Australian Government's Critical Infrastructure Resilience Strategy, which is, I think, another 30-page document related to this, they talk about what they call the Trusted Information Sharing Network. Now, the TISN, as it's called, is something that's related specifically to businesses and other organisations, and the ways in which the government can work with these organisations on all levels of government in order to ensure that critical infrastructure can be, can bounce back most quickly from a disaster or a hazard, for instance. But most importantly, that everyone is aware of their responsibilities in relation to that critical infrastructure. So we've got the Attorney General, the Critical Infrastructure Advisory Council, and then we've got different sector groups, cross-sectoral interest groups, banking and finance, water services, health, communications, food and grocery, energy, transport, and of course the Resilience Expert Advisory Group, which is most likely to be made up of different types of researchers who are involved in resilience research. What does the research tell us about how to make these different forms of critical infrastructure resilient? And then, of course, we've got things like oil and gas and security forum off the side of energy and so forth. But it is just hugely complex, and there are so many different stakeholders who are potentially involved in this. So in Australia, emergency management is run by an Australian federal government agency called Emergency Management Australia. It coordinates governmental responses to emergency incidents, and it's situated within the Attorney General's Department. I think we mentioned that a little while ago. Emergency management involves, the governance of emergency management involves plans, structures, arrangements that are established to bring together and coordinate actions of government, be it voluntary, private agencies. They're all involved in these processes in a comprehensive and coordinated way to deal with a spectrum of emergencies, so prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. Within Emergency Management Australia, we have the Security Coordination Branch, the Crisis Coordination Branch, the Crisis Support Branch, as well as the National Disaster Recovery Program Branch, which of course involves things like finances and so forth. You're going to read a little bit more about all of these in your set reading for this week, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. I will say a little bit about the overall approach that we use in Australia. It's very much resilience based, so it's everyone that needs to be involved in being resilient for a disaster in different ways. It's also a shared responsibility, and we can see that in this nice little infographic here on the slide that talks about community, commonwealth, local government, not-for-profit and business, volunteers, as well as state and territory government. Everyone is involved in this responsibility of disaster resilience. It's also an integrated approach that's based on partnerships. So it's the government is fully aware that these forms of governance can't move forward unless they have partnerships with a whole range of different organisations involved in emergency management. It's also bottom-up. So it's not about the government imposing from the top any set of particular ways of doing things. It's more about the government going to the community and asking how best we can move forward in this place, which I think is really cool. It's a really good way of doing things. It's been found to be highly effective because everyone's on the same page, so to speak, and it's not the people at the top that are influencing what happens with down on the ground without any consideration of what resources, etc., that they have on the ground. Sometimes that happens, but for the most part, it's a fairly okay approach. And we'll talk more about how things go wrong in the week where we literally talk about emergency management going wrong. And that'll include a focus on ethics as well in relation to governance of emergency management. It's an all hazards approach and it's a comprehensive approach, but the approach is also substantially based on volunteers. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. Just to give you a sense of how all of this works and the response that's required and the level at which that happens depending on the type of emergency that we're faced with or disaster that we're faced with. I've given you this little table which comes out of the handbook that I've given you to read. So the incident might be localised and of a short duration. That means it's just local command and control arrangements that are activated. The individual state or territory can handle the incident using its own resources. and the state or territory emergency management agencies are alerted for possible support to local areas. So this could be, for example, the incident where the fellow in Melbourne who was having a lot of mental health issues drove into the CBD and started driving up the footpath and running over people. Absolutely horrific incident, but certainly not what we would consider catastrophic, which is at the higher end of the scale on that image that you can see there. So catastrophic is an incident that may involve more than one state or territory, severely disrupts economic well-being, social functioning and critical infrastructure. This may be an earthquake, for instance, or a severe cyclone which passes across a whole range of jurisdictions at once. Extensive support's needed, and we can see the whole of government coordination arrangements are put into action. The Prime Minister, State Premiers and Territory Chief Ministers consult to coordinate the response and recovery, and the national emergency plans may be implemented as well as international assistance in some instances. So you can clearly see that they think about this in a scaled way as well. So we've already touched a little bit on what emergency management governance looks like internationally, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. We have touched on the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs because we talked about how that office came about historically through the General Assembly resolution in 1991, and that it was designed to strengthen the UN's response to complex emergencies and natural disasters. However, I haven't talked yet about the Sendai framework. Now, this is around disaster risk reduction, and it's a first major agreement to be put together post 2015. There was a previous agreement, the name of which I've completely forgotten. It's just gone out of my head. But within this framework, they have 7 targets and 4 priorities for action. So their priorities are understanding disaster risk, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk, and enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response, and to build back better in recovery. And often what they mean by build back better is to actually look at sustainable options to ensure that certain forms of critical infrastructure, for instance, is more has more of a capacity to bounce back or less of a capacity to be destroyed in the future. So, for instance, in a lot of bushfire affected communities, they will, after having all of the power lines destroyed in bushfires, they will often, instead of having power lines overhead, they will dig in power lines underground so that if the bushfires happen again, they don't have to worry about replacing those forms of infrastructure. It also ensures that they have communications and so forth. In the Sendai framework, we've got 7 targets. Disaster mortality are reduced by 2030. The number of affected people reduced by 2030, the economic loss reduced by 2030, and of course infrastructure damage reduced by that same year. The disaster resilience strategies, both on local and national levels, everyone should have one of these by 2020. International cooperation is increased by 2030, and EWS and DR. I've completely forgotten what EWS stands for, but I know DR stands for disaster resilience. So having an abundance of information about this available to people in different forms of preparedness training and so forth, very much increasing by 2030. Apologies there for that brain fart. So that's the Sendai framework. Now, we're talking about emergency management governance, but why are we doing this? It is fairly important for a whole range of reasons. Because number one, how we govern emergencies is linked to how accountable they are and the extent to which the ways in which we respond to emergencies can be considered legitimate. And of course, there are a whole range of different examples that we have in the past where clearly legitimacy, procedural justice, and accountability are questionable at best. Hurricane Katrina, unfortunately, I bring this one up again because it is a very, very substantial example of how this has failed in the past. So there's a little website that I found that talks about how Hurricane Katrina was a nightmare for inmates in New Orleans prisons, and particularly in Orleans Parish Prison. There was a report done by the American Civil Liberties Union called Abandoned and Abused Orleans Parish Prisoners in the Wake of Hurricane Katrina. Interviewed 1,000 people who were at OPP during those days, and they have pulled out quite a lot of really horrific things that happened within this particular prison. One of the things that was reported, Ashley George, a 13-year-old female, obviously young girl, was housed in OPP's youth centre. And she said she was moved to an adult male holding area. Holy freaking cow. The risk of her being sexually assaulted just went up like a gazillion times. Not only that, but she spent days standing in water up to her neck because they had no emergency management arrangements in place, and the people that were charged with looking after and protecting these prisoners in the event of an emergency really, really neglected their duties. And in fact, there were situations where prison officials were being held on the roof with guns to their heads by other prison officials, not inmates. It's pretty scary stuff. So these are some of the reasons why we need to talk about governance and why it's important, very much important, to have governance arrangements in place and to have people who are ethical and accountable in relation to being able to action those emergency management governance arrangements. And of course, we've had circumstances in the past where emergency management governance have raised significant humanitarian concerns. But we'll talk about that more down the track. So, hopefully, you're not as exhausted as I am at the end of this lecture, because I have to say this was very, very hard for me to write, and that you know a little bit more about the very close links between emergency management and the importance of this notion of governance and the ways in which we do it, as well as being alerted to the fact that emergency management governance is also about making sure that we do these things in ethical ways. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope you all have a fabulous week and you enjoy going through the materials, and I shall chat with you very soon. See you later.